Hello everyone, welcome to Casecracker Stories. I am Jason. Have you ever wondered what would happen to a death row inmate strapped to an electric chair after being continuously shocked for several months? How did tools designed to save lives in hospitals ultimately transform into the most horrific instruments of torture? In today's program, let us take a closer look at 3 horrifying events that actually happened. In 2006, in the state of West Virginia, USA, lived a 73-year-old man named Sherman Sizemore. One afternoon in late January 2006, Sherman was watching television at home with his wife when he suddenly let out a series of shrill, agonizing screams without warning. It terrified his wife. After regaining her composure slightly, she rushed forward to check on Sherman's condition. His face was deathly pale. He was drenched in sweat. His entire body was shaking uncontrollably. His wife was frantic. She quickly asked if he was feeling unwell or in pain. Sherman shook his head weakly. He held his wife tightly and said, "Someone is trying to bury me alive. They are also cutting my flesh away, piece by piece. It's too terrifying. It hurts too much." In the days that followed, Sherman's emotional state completely collapsed. He only allowed his wife to remain by his side. Even his own children, who came to visit, out of concern, were driven out of the house by him. He kept saying that people around him were plotting to murder him. As soon as he closed his eyes, they would take the opportunity to cut his flesh. Faced with this bizarre situation, Sherman's family was at a total loss. Even seeking help from a psychiatrist produced no results whatsoever. After 2 weeks of this turmoil, poor Sherman ended his life at home with a handgun. Regarding his death, many people believed it was possible that Sherman's brain suffered a sudden onset of dementia, resulting in these horrific hallucinations. However, Sherman's family refused to accept this explanation, because anyone who understood Sherman and his legendary life would realize that suicide was something that simply would not happen to him. First, for decades during the first half of his life, he was a hard-working coal miner. Due to the primitive working conditions in his early years, Sherman had survived numerous mine collapses. He had endured disasters like underground explosions. At times, he sustained critical injuries. Yet, in every instance, he made a full recovery. These experiences forged him. Sherman became a hardened man, indifferent to the prospect of death. It raised a question: how could a man like this take his own life? Following his retirement, Sherman took a different path. He became a pastor at the local Baptist church. Known for his tolerant and kind demeanor, Sherman was deeply respected by his congregation and the wider community. As a pastor strictly devoted to Christian doctrine, it seemed impossible that Sherman would simply choose suicide. There had to be a more complex motive involved. Driven by this conviction, Sherman's family began digging for answers. Eventually, their focus shifted to an event months prior to his death. The elderly Sherman had undergone a procedure at a facility known as Raleigh General Hospital. It was a routine cholecystectomy, the removal of his gallbladder. Although the hospital maintained that the surgical procedure followed all protocols and claimed the outcome was a success, Sherman's family went to great lengths to secure the medical records of that specific surgery. They brought the documentation to a veteran surgeon for review. Upon examination, the surgeon quickly identified an anomaly in the procedure. With a somber expression, he met with Sherman's family to recount the horrific ordeal the old man had suffered on that operating table. It began months earlier. Sherman experienced sudden, excruciating pain in his lower abdomen. After being admitted to the hospital, doctors diagnosed him with acute cholecystitis. They recommended an abdominal incision for a gallbladder removal. After consulting with his family, Sherman consented to the surgery. On the day of the procedure, Sherman was prepped and placed on the operating table. Because it was a major operation, general anesthesia was required. Administering this type of anesthesia typically involves 2 classes of drugs. The first is the anesthetic agent, designed to paralyze the nervous system. It induces a state of unconsciousness, where no pain can be felt. The second is a neuromuscular blocking agent, a muscle relaxant. This renders the patient's muscles completely limp and immobile, ensuring the surgeons can operate without interference. That day, a nurse inserted an IV catheter into Sherman's arm as he lay on the table. An oxygen mask was secured over his face. He was instructed to breathe normally and count backward from 10 to 1. This followed the standard protocol for general anesthesia. At this point, the anesthetics and muscle relaxants begin to circulate through Sherman's system. Under optimal conditions, before reaching the count of 7, he should have lapsed into a state of total sensory deprivation and complete muscular relaxation. But as Sherman lay on the operating table, he did more than count down from 10 to 1. He remained fully conscious. Something was wrong. Had a mistake been made? Anxious, Sherman tried to speak up, but as he attempted to make a sound, the horror set in. His muscles no longer responded to his brain's commands. That included his vocal cords. He couldn't even twitch a finger, let alone squeeze out a sound from his throat. The only parts of his body still capable of movement were his eyes. Unfortunately, his eyes had already been taped shut. Those standing by had no way of knowing that his eyes were darting beneath the tape in a blind panic. Inside, Sherman was screaming, "Stop! I'm still awake!" But on the table, his body remained motionless. To the lead surgeon, he looked like every other patient in the thousands of surgeries he had performed. With professional calm, he took the scalpel from the nurse. He made the incision into Sherman's abdominal cavity. Surgical retractors were used to pull the wound open, ensuring a clear field of vision. More instruments were introduced, navigating through the complex network of intestines. He eventually located the gallbladder. Every movement, every word exchanged between the doctor and the nurse. Sherman felt and heard it all. The agonizing pain hit like a continuous barrage of thunder, relentlessly assaulting his nervous system. At that moment, he likely felt that death would be a mercy. Finally, the tape covering his eyelids loosened from the violent movement of his eyes. A nurse standing nearby caught the movement. She looked into Sherman's eyes and found the old man staring back at her in pure terror. The nurse cried out, "My God, stop! He's still awake." In that instant, the entire surgical team froze. The anesthesiologist rushed over from the corner of the room. He injected the anesthetic into Sherman's body. Finally, after 16 full minutes of surgery, Sherman finally lapsed into a deep unconsciousness. But those 16 minutes of hell would undoubtedly cause massive psychological trauma. By now, the anesthesiologist had realized with horror that he had committed a catastrophic error during the procedure. During the preoperative sedation phase, he had only administered muscle relaxants to Sherman. He had forgotten the agents required for pain relief and hypnosis. Once the surgery was over and Sherman woke up, a lawsuit against him and the entire surgical team was a certainty. Who would take responsibility for that? Whether the anesthesiologist acted alone or the entire team conspired together remains unclear. They decided to cover up the medical malpractice. They administered another drug to Sherman, a substance known as midazolam. It is a potent sedative and hypnotic. In high doses, it induces short-term amnesia. Sure enough, after the surgery was completed, when Sherman slowly regained consciousness, he appeared confused. He seemed to have no memory of the previous day's events. The hospital explained this as a normal, occasional, post-operative side effect. After keeping Sherman for a few days of observation, they discharged him. But human memory is not so easily erased. Even if the surface memories were blurred by the drugs, the terror etched into his bones, and the indescribable physical agony he endured had cast a massive shadow over Sherman's subconscious. Finally, weeks after the surgery, the buried terror and memories erupted. Because the parts of Sherman's brain responsible for rational thought had no record of that day, his mind tried to interpret the horrific images and sensations sent back by his subconscious as best as it could. This led Sherman to suffer hallucinations of being harmed or even buried alive. This inexplicable yet visceral pain eventually drove him to the edge. Fortunately, his family never stopped investigating. They finally uncovered the truth in the surgical records. Eventually, in 2008, this hospital provided Sherman's family with a settlement of an undisclosed amount. However, it is presumed to be a substantial sum. Only then was a settlement reached. January 2007, at Purdue University, a prestigious institution in Indiana. The new semester had begun. A group of high-achieving freshmen arrived on campus, filled with anticipation. Among these students was a young man named Wade Steffey. Like many of his peers, he was eager to experience what was expected to be the most vibrant chapter of his life. The first week of classes concluded quickly. January 13, 2007, marked the first Friday of the new semester. It was also the start of the freshmen's first weekend on campus. These energetic freshmen were not about to let this time go to waste. Parties and celebrations were breaking out across the campus. Wade, naturally, was determined not to be left behind. That evening, after finishing dinner, he headed to a massive dormitory on campus, known as Owen Hall. He spent time drinking and talking with a few close friends in a room. At approximately 9:45 p.m., already showing signs of intoxication, they left the dorm. They headed to a lively party nearby. Once there, it was inevitable that more alcohol was consumed. Before long, the hour grew late. Wade told his friends that he had left a jacket back in the Owen Hall dormitory. He wanted to go back and retrieve it. He declined his friends' offers to accompany him. He left the party alone. Soon, a heavily intoxicated Wade arrived at the entrance of that dormitory. However, at Purdue University, the dormitories automatically lock their entrances at night. Only residents of the building can enter using their keys. For an outsider to gain entry, they must contact an acquaintance inside to let them in. Although Wade was a Purdue student, he resided in a different dormitory building. Therefore, he had no way to enter Owen Hall on his own. On his way there, he made 6 phone calls, asking if any students he knew lived in that building. They could have opened the door for him. Unfortunately, among those 6 phone calls, the 4 people he reached were living elsewhere. They were unable to provide any assistance. The other 2 individuals did reside there, but they were out attending parties that night. They never answered his calls. Consequently, when Wade arrived at the dormitory entrance, he faced the awkward reality that he could not get inside. Logically, he should have turned back to his own dorm to sleep, returning the next day at noon when the doors were unlocked. However, Wade was now in a state of advanced intoxication. Individuals in this condition often lose basic judgment and develop a dangerous fixation on a single thought. They become determined to reach their goal at any cost. Wade began to pound on the dormitory door with all his strength. The violent knocking alerted the dormitory manager. The manager stepped out to investigate and found the intoxicated Wade. After questioning him and confirming he was not a resident, the manager ordered him to leave the premises. Fortunately, Wade was not the type to become belligerent when drunk. He nodded dizzily and stumbled away from the scene. But the following day, Wade's roommate realized he was missing. The state of the room indicated Wade had not returned to sleep the previous night. 2 more days passed. Wade failed to show up for his classes. It was then everyone realized something was seriously wrong. The university and the police were notified of Wade's disappearance. Investigators obtained the location data for Wade's cell phone from his service provider. The record suggested he was still within the perimeter of the campus. Over the following week, hundreds of police officers and student volunteers searched nearly every corner of Purdue University. Members of the university's equestrian club also searched the open fields surrounding the campus on horseback. no trace of Roe v. Wade was found. The only lead was a single shoe belonging to Wade, discovered on the grass outside the Owen Hall dormitory. As time passed, morale began to fade. Fewer people continued the search for Wade. Eventually, the university returned to its usual routine. Wade's name was mentioned less and less. Until March 10, 2007. Exactly 2 months after Wade vanished. That afternoon, a university staff member, she was working in the laundry room on the basement level of the dormitory building. Suddenly, from somewhere nearby, she heard a very loud cracking sound. It sounded like an electrical spark bursting. Initially, she suspected one of the dozen washing machines in front of her had malfunctioned. But soon, there was another loud pop. The staff member determined the sound was likely coming from the electrical distribution room next door. She stepped out of the laundry room, produced a ring of keys, found the key to the distribution room, and opened the door. This was a completely sealed room, rarely entered by anyone other than the school electricians. The worker reached out and switched on the overhead lights. Before her stood a massive transformer that occupied nearly the entire room. At first glance, nothing seemed out of order. However, an indescribable odor was drifting through the air. It smelled like charred meat. The worker entered the distribution room to conduct a closer inspection. Seconds later, following a horrific scream, the worker scrambled out of the room in a state of sheer terror. The police who arrived shortly after were also stunned by the scene. They finally reconstructed the sequence of events regarding the horrific ordeal Wade faced after his disappearance. It turned out that on the night of January 13th, after being turned away by the dormitory manager, Wade's intoxicated and fixated mind had not abandoned the idea of entering the building to retrieve his clothes. He began circling the dormitory building. Eventually, he reached the exterior entrance to the electrical distribution room. Although this entrance lacked a no trespassing sign, its appearance alone made it clear that it was not intended for students or general staff. The door was located within a semi-basement structure, surrounded by a low perimeter fence. Under normal circumstances, passing students would have no reason to climb over it to investigate. But that night, the drunken Wade didn't care. Searching for an alternative entrance, he climbed over without a second thought. He reached out to open the door. This door was usually kept locked. But by sheer coincidence, an electrician had been working inside earlier that day and forgot to lock the door upon leaving. Wade pulled the door, and it opened. The intoxicated Wade stepped inside. The distribution room was in total darkness. Wade couldn't find the light switch. He started to worry. He thought if he walked inside and the door closed behind him, what would he do if he got locked in? So he took off one of his shoes and wedged it into the door frame. He wanted to prevent the door from closing completely. Then, he continued further into the room. As previously mentioned, this room housed a massive transformer. Its function was to take the high voltage current from the main power lines and convert it into a voltage suitable for standard appliances, used by the students and staff throughout the building. Wade's objective was to cross the room, exit through the other side, and enter the building. He placed his hand on the transformer casing and felt his way toward the wall. Between the transformer and the wall, there was just enough space for a person to squeeze through sideways. An intoxicated Wade turned sideways and forced himself in. Halfway through, likely due to his drunken instability, Wade's legs buckled. He instinctively reached out to grab the transformer casing to steady himself. This was a fatal mistake. The transformer casing featured a specific design element, a 2-centimeter wide gap intended for electricians to observe the internal components. The area was covered in high-voltage warning signs. In the pitch black, Wade couldn't see them. The ring finger of his left hand slid directly into the gap. Almost instantaneously, Wade was electrocuted and killed by the high-voltage current. Because he was in such a cramped space, even after life had left him, his body remained in a standing position. His finger remained wedged in that gap. The next day, another electrician found a shoe propping the distribution room door open. He peered inside. Naturally, he failed to see Wade, who was pinned between the transformer and the wall. He tossed the shoe onto the grass and locked the door. Days later, police searching for Wade found his shoe nearby. 2 officers also entered the distribution room through different entrances to conduct a search. However, they only glanced inside from the doorways. They assumed there was nowhere for a person to hide and left. Consequently, Wade's remains were left forgotten in that narrow crevice. He was subjected to the constant, searing heat of high-voltage currents. Finally, after 2 months, his body had been completely desiccated by the heat. The current began to arc through the surrounding air. It produced a massive electrical explosion. This finally drew the attention of the school janitor. The remains were discovered. Following the incident, Wade's parents filed a lawsuit against Purdue University. They alleged a failure to post conspicuous warning signs at the entrance of a high-risk area. The hazardous site, which should have been secured, was left unlocked. Ultimately, the university paid a settlement of $500,000 to Wade's parents. They also established a scholarship in Wade's name. The case was finally closed. Schlitterbahn is a water park founded in Texas. By 2008, it had opened several locations across the state of Texas. It was a popular choice for local families seeking entertainment and relief from the summer heat. Generally, parks with numerous large-scale, high-speed amusement facilities harbor significant latent safety hazards. Under the law, professional third-party organizations are required to conduct periodic evaluations and inspections of all park facilities. However, because it was a major taxpayer, combined with local support for homegrown brands, the Texas government granted a special exemption. All Schlitterbahn parks were permitted to conduct self-inspections, bypassing third-party oversight. Following the grant of such immense privilege, Schlitterbahn's owner became overconfident. It happened to coincide with the post-2008 financial crisis. The economy had entered a period of recession. To regain the public's attention, to stimulate consumer spending, inventor and park owner Jeff Henry decided. Inventor and CEO conceived a shocking project to build the world's tallest and fastest water slide. In his design, the water slide needed to reach a height of 51 meters. When riders plummeted down in their rafts, they would reach a top speed of 110 kilometers per hour. Upon hearing his proposal, every qualified designer shook their head. They stated the safety risks were too severe. It should never be built. But Jeff refused to back down. He brought in a close friend named John Schooley to serve as the designer. Consequently, this monstrous slide took shape. It was designed by these 2 individuals, neither of whom possessed any design or engineering qualifications. The blueprints were drafted haphazardly, 1 stroke at a time, between the 2 of them. Then, another complication surfaced. Not a single contractor was willing to take on the construction of the project. Left with no other choice, Jeff and John had to recruit their own crew of laborers. Construction began. Due to a complete lack of relevant construction experience, compounded by the inherent flaws in the slide's design, various issues arose during the building and testing phases. The most critical problem was discovered later, when the main structure was completed and testing commenced. After riders in the rafts plunged down from the summit, the velocity was either insufficient, making it impossible to clear the second incline, or the velocity was excessive, causing the raft to launch directly off the second incline. Had these been actual human passengers, the result would have been death, or, at the very least, critical injury. Despite constant adjustments to the water flow and the angle of the second incline, they struggled for a long period without being able to guarantee 100% safety. With nearly $4 million already sunk into the project, persistent delays meant the asset was failing to generate any revenue. Finally, the owner, Jeff, reached a breaking point. He decided to fit the slide with a so-called safety device. This so-called safety device was, in reality, extremely crude. It consisted of dense metal guardrails installed at the second incline, covered with a nylon rope mesh. The logic was that if a raft became airborne off the incline, the netting would force it back down into the flume. Believing the problem was perfectly resolved, Jeff and John triumphantly announced the completion of the slide. Following a massive promotional campaign, the water slide, given the German name Verrückt, officially opened to the public. To any trained eye, the reality was obvious. The safety hazards of this slide were catastrophic. According to a later account from a safety inspector, when he first saw the slide on the news, he felt a surge of pure horror, because as riders plummeted down the slide at speeds of 110 kilometers per hour, any part of their bodies that made contact with the iron rails or the nylon netting above the flume, that limb would likely be severed from the body like a hot knife through butter. Had he been the one to conduct the inspection, an operating permit would never have been issued. But the reality was frustrating. The water park held government-issued self-assessment credentials. Consequently, the slide faced no regulatory resistance. It officially commenced operations in July 2014. Over the following 2 years, exactly as the owner, Jeff, had anticipated, leveraging the title of the world's tallest water slide, the park regained its popularity. It generated massive financial returns, but behind the facade of success, there were bloodstains. In those 2 years, 13 accidents occurred on this slide. Almost every incident involved guests colliding with or being ejected into the safety netting, resulting in injuries. These victims suffered various severe injuries, including concussions, lumbar spine sprains, and facial lacerations. However, the park management utilized its PR and legal teams, along with forcing lifeguards on duty to cover up these incidents by entering false information on accident reports. To the public, it remained known only as a recreational activity that was both thrilling and safe. Then, on August 7, 2016, a horrific tragedy occurred. That day, a 10-year-old boy named Caleb Schwab arrived at the Schlitterbahn water park with his parents and his older brother. Due to the constant television advertisements, personally experiencing the world's tallest water slide had been Caleb's long-held wish. It was his ultimate goal. As soon as they entered the park, he ran straight toward it. He quickly reached the top of the slide. He climbed into the raft with 2 other passengers. Per the regulations, each raft was limited to 3 people. Furthermore, the total weight of the 3 passengers had to fall between 180 and 250 kilograms. For the raft Caleb boarded, the combined weight of the 3 individuals was 248 kilograms, just within the maximum weight capacity. But the problem was that 10-year-old Caleb weighed only 34 kilograms. The weights of the other 2 passengers were 89 kilograms and a staggering 125 kilograms. With such a massive weight discrepancy, the employee responsible for seating them at the time should have addressed the balance issue. The best course of action would have been to seat the lightest, Caleb, in the middle, with the other 2 passengers at the front and rear of the raft. However, the staff member on duty that day merely noted that the total weight was within the limit. They were cleared for departure without proper inspection. No one noticed that Caleb, the lightest passenger, was seated at the very front. The heaviest tourist was seated in the rear. This created a severe weight imbalance between the bow and the stern of the raft. Seconds later, the horror began. The raft carrying the 3 passengers was observed. It accelerated down the first vertical drop. Then, it hit the second incline at a lethal speed. Because the front was too light and the rear too heavy, the raft went airborne at the crest of the slope. It slammed violently into the metal support beams and the safety netting. Bystanders who witnessed the impact erupted into screams of terror. Caleb's parents were waiting at the base of the slide. His brothers stood frozen in shock. When they rushed toward the site of the accident, attempting to check on Caleb's condition, they were intercepted by park security. The scene was too gruesome for public view. Staff refused to let the family witness the carnage. Upon high-speed impact, with the metal hoops of the slide. Caleb, seated in the front, was instantly decapitated. The two passengers behind him suffered severe facial fractures. The water on the slide turned red instantly. The water slide had become a literal river of blood. Now that there was a fatality, combined with the fact that Caleb's father was a state legislator, the park could no longer suppress the scandal. Although the park reopened after only 3 days, the water slide itself was decommissioned permanently. In early 2017, the park paid Caleb's family a $20 million settlement. The other two victims also received payouts. While the exact figures remain undisclosed, they are presumed to be substantial. A settlement was ultimately reached with the park. In 2018, the prosecution charged them with involuntary manslaughter. Jeff and John faced 17 felony counts, including endangering a minor. Indictments were handed down against Jeff and John. However, following a rigorous defense by their legal team, all charges were dismissed in early 2019. As for the lethal water slide, it was dismantled in mid-2018, scrubbed entirely from the site. That concludes today's report. Thank you for your continued support. We will see you in the next case file.